Hi there. Hi again. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about argument mapping, specifically in connection to the articles that were assigned for this week. There are 3 of them, so you should check the Moodle page and read those articles. It will be good to especially have read the New York Times article before watching this lecture, because I'll be talking about it a lot. So, in this week's lecture, we'll be talking about argument structures, premises, and conclusions. First of all, what arguments are and how they're structured. We'll be talking about a specific kind of argument, which is inductive arguments. We'll be talking about argument maps in general, what it means to make a map of an argument and how to do that. I'll be doing a sample map of the argument that's given in the New York Times piece that you're assigned for this week. It's called Colleges Must Reopen in the Fall. Here's how we do it. So that is an article that appeared in the New York Times, and I'll be mapping that argument in this lecture to show you how to do it. I'll talk about your argument mapping assignment, which is due at the end of the week on Sunday, and I'll leave you with some questions to think about at the end. So to begin with, argument structures, premises, and conclusions. So what is an argument? An argument is a set of reasons to believe something. Okay, it's anytime you present some claim or some idea that you think ought to convince people that something else is true, you're presenting an argument. Arguments are all over the world. They're ubiquitous. They're certainly all over your social media feeds if you are on social media, and you do not have to look hard to find an argument. Okay, arguments have 2 parts, premises and conclusions. The reasons you're giving to believe something, those reasons are called the premises, and the thing that you're urging people to believe based on those reasons is called the conclusion. Okay, in this class we'll sometimes write arguments in a standard form called premise-conclusion form. When we do that, the argument looks like this. Okay, this is just an example. This argument has 3 premises. The first one is blueberries are incredibly delicious. The second one is blueberries are amazingly nutritious. And the third one is that everyone loves blueberries. Okay, and the conclusion of this argument is that blueberries are the best food on the planet. Okay, so when we write arguments in premise-conclusion form like this, there's a few important parts. And you're going to be doing this as part of the argument mapping assignment. So this is important. The most important part is the line here that separates the premises from the conclusion. Okay, because that line tells me that you know where the difference is, which part of the argument is the premises and which part is the conclusion. That line does the job of marking that difference. Okay, another important thing about writing arguments in premise-conclusion form is that it's important to number each premise. We try to make each premise a single, clear statement so that we can number them, and then when we map the argument, we'll be able to move those statements around and see how they connect to one another. Okay, so we don't want to build too many ideas into one premise. We want to keep each premise sort of on its own track, making one clear, concise statement. Okay, so this is an argument in premise-conclusion form. Note that just because something's an argument doesn't mean that it's a good one. Okay, and that happened to be a very bad argument that I gave you based on what I happened to be eating when I made this PowerPoint. But that's the basis of argument structure. So you want numbered premises. Each premise should be a clear statement. And make sure you have a line that separates the premises from the conclusion. Okay. You also want to label the conclusion. So I put conclusion here. I wrote the word conclusion. Okay, that's important too, so that I know that you've identified which part of the argument is the conclusion. Okay, moving on to inductive arguments, the kind of argument that we're going to be dealing with most in this class. Inductive arguments are just one kind of argument. There are different kinds of arguments. We're going to be talking about inductive arguments because that's the argument we're going to be dealing with most. Okay, The first thing to note about inductive arguments is that they're based on probabilities. What that means is what we want in an argument is for the argument to take us from starting with something true to ending up with something true, okay? And when we say that an inductive argument is based on probabilities, what we mean is that if the premises are true, then there's a very high probability that the conclusion is going to be true. That's what we're aiming for with an inductive argument. We want the truth of the premises to make it very likely or highly probable that the conclusion is going to be true also, okay? Again, arguments are supposed to take us somewhere. They're supposed to take us from true premises to a hopefully true conclusion, okay? And if it's a strong inductive argument, that means that there's a good connection between the premises and the conclusion. Namely, that if those premises are correct, if they're true, then the conclusion is very likely to be true. Okay? Separately, we can ask about the premises of the argument themselves and ask, are these premises themselves true? Okay? We're using the word strong for an inductive argument in a very specific sense in this class. Okay? It doesn't mean that it's a good argument just because it's a strong argument. If it's a strong argument, that has to do with the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. We have another word for if the argument is a strong argument and its premises are also true, and that word is a cogent inductive argument. Okay, we're defining these words in this way. It's not the way you might use these words in everyday speech. Okay, so again, if we have a strong argument, that means that the premises make it likely that the conclusion is true. How strong the argument is depends on how likely the conclusion is to be true based on the premises we've given. Okay, and if it's a cogent argument, it has to be a strong argument. There has to be the right kind of relationship between the premises and the conclusion, and it also has to have true premises. Okay, so let's look back at our blueberry example. Okay, is this a strong argument? Well, to consider whether it's a strong argument, we have to ask, if all of these premises were true, forget about whether they are true or not. Just imagine that they're all true. Suppose that they're all true. The question of whether the argument is strong is about how likely, if all those premises are true, how likely the conclusion is to follow. And this argument is not very strong. Why? Because the conclusion totally outstrips those premises. Even if it were true that blueberries are incredibly delicious and nutritious, and I think they are both. Even if it were true that everyone loves blueberries, it's still a big stretch to say that blueberries are the best food on the planet. There are a lot of other contenders. Okay, so even if all those premises were true, we wouldn't have a very good basis for assuming that the conclusion is likely to be true. Okay, but beyond that, we can ask whether the premises themselves are true. Even if it were a strong argument, the question would remain, is it a cogent argument? Are the premises true? And these premises seem pretty clearly false, at least the third premise, that everyone loves blueberries. Probably some of you don't even like blueberries. So this argument is neither strong nor cogent. Okay, let's look at a different argument as an example. Okay, this argument also has three premises. The first one is that COVID-19 is spreading rapidly in the US. The second premise is that COVID-19 causes an array of horrifying long-term conditions, including respiratory illness, neurological damage, and even death, and many others. The third premise is that wearing masks in public when social distancing isn't possible reduces the spread of COVID-19 significantly. And the conclusion is that people in the US should wear masks in public when social distancing isn't possible. Okay, I would say this argument is both strong and cogent. Okay, I would have to defend that view by providing support for each of these premises if I haven't already convinced you. But not only does it seem that if all those premises are true, there's a good chance that people should be wearing masks, there's good evidence that all of these premises are also true, okay? Which is why this argument is both strong and cogent. Okay, now some of you are like, all right, I get it, let's move on. And most of you, if I'm right based on having taught this material before, are already a little bit lost, okay? So don't give up yet, because this stuff is important. And what we're doing now is learning about inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are how we reason a lot of the time. And we have a lot of problems in the world, so we have to think clearly about how we're reasoning. Okay, so if you're already feeling lost and you're confused about the difference between cogency and premises and conclusions and all these terms that I've been throwing out, spend some time going back and reviewing the lecture up to this point. That will help you, and it's important to understand this stuff. Okay, so what I just did there was give you another argument for why it's important to understand this stuff, which is how we are reasoning. Okay, so here's the argument that I've just given you. Solving the world's problems requires us to think clearly, and clear thinking involves understanding how we're reasoning, how we're thinking, how we're moving from premises to conclusions. We should try to solve the world's problems in order to avert a catastrophe, and therefore we should try to understand how we reason, and inductive arguments are a large part of our reasoning. So hang in there and take the time you need to comprehend this stuff, and please ask questions in the comment section or by email. I'm happy to answer questions or even meet with you on Zoom if you're having trouble understanding some of this stuff. Okay, so we're going to keep moving along now to argument maps. Okay, so when we map an argument, what we're trying to do is bring out all the pieces of the argument and show in a visual representation how the different pieces of the argument fit together. So we'll bring back our blueberry argument here. So you can see this is the argument just as it appeared above. Okay, and to draw a map of the argument, we're going to use the numbers that we've numbered these premises with to represent the premise that is assigned to that number. And we're going to use the letter C down here, you can see, to represent the conclusion that blueberries are the best food on the planet. And then we're going to draw arrows to show which premises, which claims in this argument, which ideas are provided as support for other claims in the argument. Okay, so when one arrow points from one number to another, that means that the number it's pointing from is offering support for the number it's pointing to. Support in the sense of being a reason to believe that. Okay, and when we map arguments, we're really just trying to get at our interpretation of what the author's intention is. Okay, even if it's a bad argument like this one, and the premises offer very little support for the conclusion, because this conclusion is so bold, we still would draw the arrow there because that's how the argument is being presented. Okay, so how would we map this argument to show the relationship between the premises and the conclusion? Well, this is how. Okay, so over here on the right hand side, you'll see each number, which represents each premise, is pointing directly towards the conclusion. And what that means is that each premise separately is trying to support the conclusion. The reason these arrows are drawn from each of these numbers individually is because each premise offers individual support to the conclusion. Okay, that's how the argument is being presented. Okay, we can contrast that with the second argument we just looked at about map squaring. When we map this argument, even though the structure looks the same when we set it up in premise-conclusion form, even though the structure looks the same, the map is going to be very different. And why is that? Because these premises don't support the conclusion on their own. You have to take the premises in relation to one another in order to get the support for the conclusion. Okay, so I would map this argument perhaps like this. Okay, so premise 1 COVID-19 is spreading rapidly, okay, that doesn't by itself give us a reason to wear masks unless we consider it with a third premise that masks actually reduce the spread. Okay, so because it's spreading rapidly and masks reduce the spread, that's why we have a reason to wear the masks in public. Okay, so 1 and 3 only support the conclusion when taken together. Okay, and that's why this arrow over here that's pointing down to the conclusion originates from the plus sign, from the intersection of these two premises. Okay, and likewise, premise 2, that COVID-19 causes horrifying conditions, that also by itself wouldn't give us a reason to wear masks unless it's also considered alongside the third premise that wearing masks actually help reduce the spread. Okay, so we have to consider each of these pairs of premises before they sort of do the work to help establish the conclusion. Okay, now mapping arguments is often a matter of interpretation, and I think in the case of this argument, there's more than one interpretation that could be equally correct. So I've also included this option. Okay, because you could reasonably argue, I think, that even taken together, 1 and 3, the fact that COVID-19 is spreading rapidly and that wearing masks reduces the spread, that those two wouldn't really give us a reason to wear a mask unless COVID-19 was really, really awful, which is what premise 2 is asserting. Okay, so you might justifiably argue that you need all 3 of these premises together to provide any support to the conclusion. That even the pairs of premises, which I considered in this version, won't by themselves provide that support. Though I think you could also make the case that they do provide that support. Okay, so if you have more questions about these 2 alternative interpretations, feel free to ask them in the comments. But part of why I included both of them is also so you know that there's not always only one exact right way to interpret an argument. There might be equally legitimate interpretations of how an author is presenting an argument. That doesn't mean that every interpretation is correct. Okay? It could be that some are wrong and some interpretations are just incorrect. They're inaccurate representations of what the author was trying to convey, how the argument works together. And that there are a few correct interpretations, that there's some ambiguity about how exactly the author intends for the premises to motivate their conclusion. Okay, so where are we at? Well, we started out with this list of items to accomplish in today's lecture. Okay, we're right in the middle now. We've done argument structures. I talked about the premises and conclusion of an argument, how to write them in standard form with that big line between the premises and the conclusion, to number your premises and make sure that each premise is a concise single statement. We talked about inductive arguments and what it means for an inductive argument to be a strong argument and a cogent argument and how those are separate. To be a strong argument means you have the right structure, the right relationship between your premises and your conclusion, independently of whether the premises are actually true. To be a cogent argument means that the argument is both inductively strong and that the premises are true. Okay, and I just gave you a few sample argument maps based on arguments that were very simple in the sense that they had just a few premises. So there wasn't much work to do to figure out how they all fit together. And I showed you how to draw the arrows from the number representing the premise to the conclusion or to whatever claim it's supporting. When we get more premises within an argument, we'll have arrows pointing between premises if some premises are offered in support of other premises. And how to draw the arrows if premises work together and have to be taken together in order to understand how they could support the claim that they're supporting. Okay, that's a lot of information we've already covered, and I kind of moved through it pretty quickly, so you might need to go back and review it or to ask questions either in the comment section of the video or in the discussion forum or in my email. Okay, so now we're going to move on to map the argument in the article that was assigned for this week, one of them called Colleges Must Reopen in the Fall. Here's how we do it, which was in the New York Times. So one thing I recommend is that if you haven't read that article, you pause the video right now and go read it before you come back to it. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do to map an argument in an article like this is to try to write the argument in premise conclusion form. And that argument that you write out in premise conclusion form, following the instructions I've given you before this about how to write arguments in premise conclusion form, that argument that you write that way will be part of the assignment that you'll turn in for your argument map. Okay, and the way to do that is to go through the argument paragraph by paragraph, read it very, very carefully, and try to write down every point that's important in a concise way, and to separate each point and number it. Okay, the first thing you should do is find out what the conclusion of the argument is. Okay, before you go through and write out those premises one by one, you want to identify the conclusion so that you know where you're aiming. What's the end point of the argument? What are they trying to establish overall? And in the case of this article, it was pretty clear because the conclusion is the title of the article, Colleges Must Reopen in the Fall. Okay, so that's what this author is going to be arguing. That's the conclusion of the argument. So every premise is ultimately trying to get us to that conclusion, that colleges must reopen in the fall. So as we read through the article, we want to try to keep our conclusion in mind and identify each premise that's part of this argument. Okay, and we can do that paragraph by paragraph, going one paragraph at a time and trying to identify what are the important points in this paragraph. Okay, this paragraph that I've got in front of you here is the second paragraph of the article, and it says, the toll of this pandemic is high and will continue to rise, but another crisis looms for students, higher education, and the economy if colleges cannot open their campuses in the fall. Okay, so what's the main point of this little paragraph? Well, I think there are two. The first one identified, which I put as the first premise in my argument when I wrote it in premise conclusion form, is this: if colleges don't reopen their campuses in the fall, higher education will be in a crisis. Okay, I think this is a main point of this paragraph. I think a second main point is that if colleges don't reopen their campuses in the fall, the economy will be in a crisis. But I've gotten to that point further down in the argument. Okay, so I have written this argument in premise conclusion form, and I posted it as part of my map, and I'll bring that up here. So here is my interpretation of this argument in premise conclusion form. Okay, scrolling through it, I found 18 premises that I thought were important. Okay, and I just wrote them in a list. I put them in the order that they appeared in the article, pretty much. Okay, and then I drew that big thick line, which is the most important part of writing an argument in premise conclusion form. And underneath the line, I wrote the word conclusion. And this time I put a C so that I can represent the conclusion with that C in the map that I draw. Okay, so that's my argument, and you can find my argument in a file called Sample Argument Map, which is linked in this section of the Moodle page. Okay, so the first part of your argument map is going to be the argument written in premise conclusion form like this. Okay, you're going to do this with an article that I haven't already done. Okay, so any of the remaining 2 articles for your assignment. So I'm just doing this as an example. And the way you'll submit the assignment, it should be modeled after my example. Okay, so you'll submit the argument written in premise conclusion form, and then the map, which we're going to get to. Just like I did for my article, the one in the New York Times. Okay, but you're going to do it for one of the other articles, not the New York Times article, because I already did that one. Okay, so I have those 18 premises. How do they all fit together? How are we going to draw a map of this argument? It's going to be a lot more complex than the simple maps that we looked at for the blueberry argument and the mask wearing argument. But it's not so complex that we can't understand it at all. And the easiest way to then sort through the premises is to break them down. And what I found when I broke them down is that actually this argument contains a lot of little arguments put together. So the first little argument, I think, is contained in the first 6 premises of my argument written in standard form, in premise conclusion form. Okay, so here are the first 6 premises I think all kind of go together. So as I make my argument map, I'm going to start with these 6 premises, and I'm going to try to figure out which of these claims support others of these claims. Okay, and what are they kind of, is there one grand point that the rest of these claims are kind of trying to support together? And I think there is, and I think the main point of these 6 claims here is the first one. Okay, so that's where my argument map for this smaller section of the map of this argument, that's where I think the arrows are going to point to. Okay, so if colleges don't reopen their campuses in the fall, higher education will be in a crisis. I think the remaining premises that you're looking at now, 2 through 6, offer support to this first premise in some fashion. Okay, how do the rest of them fit together? Well, I think it goes something like this. Okay, so you'll notice that 4, 5, and 6, I think, all work together. They provide support for the first premise, that we're going to face a crisis if we don't reopen our campuses. They provide support for that premise as a unit, 4, 5, and 6. The idea is if they don't open, people may not enroll, revenues based half on enrollment, and there's going to be a catastrophic loss of tuition if people don't enroll. And thus, if there's that kind of catastrophic loss of revenue, a lot of colleges are going to close. Okay, that's the crisis that the author has in mind when they argue that if we don't reopen, we're going to face an education crisis, a higher education crisis. Okay, 2 and 3, I think, are offered as support for the idea that if we don't open, a lot of people aren't going to enroll. Okay, and those premises are that learning online, remote learning, presents a lot of barriers, especially for low-income students. Okay, so that's the idea, is that because of those barriers that online learning presents, or remote learning, people won't enroll if we're entirely online, if we don't open. Okay, so, and if they don't enroll, then we have 4, 5, and 6. All those points go together. And that's why if we don't open our college campuses, according to this author, higher education is going to be in a crisis. Okay, so just looking at that part, you can pause now, make sure you understand how this part fits together. You might also want to be opening up the sample argument map so you can see the whole argument at once while you watch this lecture. But that's my interpretation of how the author motivated these first 6 points. Okay, the second part of this argument, given in this article, I think is the next 4 premises that I wrote in my interpretation of the argument. Okay, it's the idea that higher education employs 3 million people and is a huge part of the U.S. economy, very important to it. and therefore that it will lead to an economic crisis, and thus that we have to make it a national priority to reopen our colleges. Okay, so if we follow that line of reasoning and we draw it in a map, it would look something like that. Okay, so the fact that higher education employs 3 million people, that's premise 7, and pumped $600 billion of spending into the US economy last year, or 2 years ago. That is why we should think, that's why the author's arguing it's important to the larger economy. Okay, that's the evidence that the author is giving for why higher education is so important to the larger economy. It's because it's so important that failing to open colleges will lead to an economic crisis. Okay, that's just how important it is. Okay, so the fact that it's so important is why we should think that if we don't open colleges in the fall, we'll have an economic crisis. And it's because not opening them in the fall will lead to an economic crisis that we have to make it a national priority to reopen colleges. Hi. Okay. Moving on to the next part, which I think is the most complicated part of the argument that I've written. Okay, I have these 6 premises, 11 through 16. Okay, and it took me a while, maybe 45 minutes, to just work with this part of the argument and figure out how I thought the map had to be written and what the premises were exactly. At first, I had combined numbers 11 and 12 into one premise, that colleges can and must be serious about controlling the spread of disease on campus. But for the sake of mapping the argument, I had to separate those out into 2 different points because there's different support given for each of them. And our goal in mapping this argument is to make that clear. So I had to use separate numbers so that I could make that clear in my argument map. Okay, so first, the part of this section that I think shows how some of these premises are connected is that 13 provides support for 11. Okay, the fact that we have well-known protocols for controlling infectious disease is providing support for the idea that we can take this on. The author wants to convince us that we are able to be serious about controlling this disease spread. Okay, that we have what it takes, specifically well-known protocols for controlling disease spread. That's what 13 is saying. We have what it takes to allow us to control this disease spread. That this is a task that we are up to. Okay, that's what the author wants us to believe. Okay, so 13 is providing support for 11. Okay, how about the rest? Well, 14, 15, and 16 are just 3 examples of these protocols. Okay, widespread testing once you arrive on campus and throughout the semester, contact tracing, which is going to have to be more extensive than traditional versions of contact tracing, and a way to isolate students who are ill or who have been exposed. Okay, we're going to just sort of think of those together so we don't get too confused when we draw our map, because they're kind of serving the same role. Okay, how do we draw the rest of this map? Well, I think it looks something like this. Okay, let's ignore this arrow between 11 and 12 for a moment and just think 12 and 13, this idea that we have, again, well-known protocols for controlling disease spread, and that we have to get serious about controlling the spread. Okay, that's what I think together provides support for these specific examples of the protocols that will help us control disease spread. Okay, the fact that we have to be serious about this and that we have well-known ways to do that. That's what I think is supporting the need for implementing these well-known effective ways to control disease spread. Okay, so that's why 12 and 13 together here establish 14, 15, and 16 each independently. Okay, the fact that we have to be serious about it and that we have well-known ways to do that give us a reason to 14, test regularly. They also give us a reason to contact trace, which is what 15 says, and they also give us a reason to isolate people who've been exposed. Okay, now the link between 11 and 12 Okay, I think that here, the fact that we can do this, that we are up to this task, is part of what's motivating the author to argue that we have to do it. Okay, the fact that we can do it is being used to support this idea that we have to do that. Okay, we have to be serious about controlling this spread of disease. Okay, and you'll notice over here that 11 is pointing to 12 only. It's not pointing to the combination of 12 and 13, just to 12. Okay, so take some time to think about this section and look it over. I think there are actually more interconnections here than I've represented, but to keep it relatively straightforward, I didn't include the more minor connections, but I'll leave that to you to either ask about in the discussion forum or in the video comments, and to think for yourself. Maybe you think I've misinterpreted this argument, which is possible. So if you think you have a better interpretation, let me know, and we'll talk about how I could be wrong. Okay, so the last two premises in my reconstruction are these two, number 17 and 18. And before I pull up the map for 17 and 18, how they are connected to one another, try to think for yourself, how would you represent this part of the argument? Okay, so 17 says, although they will be difficult and costly and raise concerns about the protection of civil liberties, the precautions are worth it to allow colleges to reopen safely. Okay, they're talking about the precautions of widespread testing, contact tracing, and isolation that we talked about in the last slide. Okay, that's number 17. Number 18 says there's a huge benefit to in-person education. Okay, fierce intellectual debates, research opportunities, personal interaction, etc. Okay, how do these connect? Pause the video now and decide for yourself before you hear my interpretation. So here it is now. I think it looks like that. Okay, it's the benefit from in-person education that I believe leads the author to conclude that all these difficult and costly accommodations are worth it. Okay, so what are we left with? Well, we've got 18 premises, and we've shown how those premises can be broken down into smaller subsets and mapped as sort of smaller arguments within the larger argument. Now, how are we going to piece it all together? Well, again, we got to keep our eye on the ball. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion of this grand argument that all the 18 premises come together to support is that college campuses must reopen in the fall. Okay, so that's our target. So we're going to write that at the bottom here. We're going to represent that conclusion with the letter C. And all of our 18 premises are somehow going to end up here on letter C. So how are we going to get there? Well, the first thing we need to do is just bring in the work that we've just done already. Okay, so we start with our map of arguments, premises 1 through 6, which looked like that. Okay, you can scroll back in the video to see that. I'm also going to post a PowerPoint, this PowerPoint that I'm showing you in the video. I will post a PDF of it online, so you'll be able to go back and look at the steps at your own pace. Okay, that was the first section that we mapped. This was the second section, 7 through 10. Next came 11 through 16, and it looked like that. And finally, 18 and 17. Okay, so these are just the 4 smaller arguments that we already mapped. Now we have to figure out how they each support the conclusion. Okay, so this is another place where it would be good for you to pause the video and look at the argument map, the PDF of the sample argument map, so you can see the entire argument in premise conclusion form at once, and try to figure out how does each of these smaller sections of the argument relate to the conclusion. And we'll just take them one at a time. So the first one, I think, relates like that. Okay? The fact that not reopening is going to lead to a crisis in higher education is one of the main motivators for why we should think that colleges have to reopen. Okay, so that's premise 1 here, supporting the conclusion. Okay, next. I think that premise 9 supports the conclusion more than premise 10. And to see that, I'm going to go back up here to where this section was mapped. Here. Okay, and I think it's the economic crisis point that leads to the conclusion, more than the fact that we have to make this a national priority. Having to make it a national priority is not a reason that we must reopen. Okay? Having an economic crisis is both a reason for reopening and a reason for reopening to be a national priority. Okay, so 9 supports 10, and 9 supports the conclusion of the overarching argument altogether. Okay, take some time to let that sink in, because it's confusing. Okay, how about this other really complex argument that I said was the most convoluted part of the whole argument map? It certainly gave me the most challenge. Well, I think that here it's premise 11 that supports the conclusion. Okay, and we can go back up again to look at this part of the argument. It looked like that. Okay, and it's really the idea that we can be serious about this that supports the conclusion that we have to reopen. Okay, and to understand that, you might think of an objection to the argument that we have to reopen in the fall. An objection would say we can't reopen in the fall because we don't have the technology, we don't have the capacity to be as serious as we need to be about reducing disease spread. And this is saying, no, we do. We can control this. We are up to this task. That's part of why it's important that we reopen. Okay? The side argument over here about what protocols are necessary really is captured by the second part of the title of this essay, Here's How We Do It. Okay? And I don't think the specific recommendations are presented as reasons for reopening. They're just providing support for the idea that we can accomplish this task. And so we have to reopen. Okay, and then let's get back to here. Finally, 17 and 18 over there. 18 says there are tremendous benefits from in-person learning, like the intellectual debates that you can only have in person, the research opportunities, etc. And that's why all of these hardships of reopening will be totally worth it. Okay, and in this case, I think that the support for the conclusion comes from how important it is to learn in person, which is captured in premise 18. Okay, that's the map. Now, I just messed this up, but I'm gonna just go with it because there. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's just pause for a second. And this is where if I were teaching you in person, I would be taking lots of questions, and we'd probably finish the day just taking questions and analyzing what we just did. And again, I just want to say, I'm not sure that my interpretation is correct. So if you have some criticism of my interpretation, or you think I missed a point, or that my map was incorrect in some way, please don't be afraid to bring that up and talk about it in the comments or the class discussion section. I'm also learning as we go, and that was a complicated argument to map. So I hope it's helped you, though, understand how to map arguments. Okay, so for the argument mapping assignment, you're going to do what I just did. in one of the remaining articles. Okay, so in the end, your argument map should look something like, the assignment as a whole should look something like this. The assignment that I did, which is here. Sorry, let me. Okay, so this is my version of having done the assignment for the New York Times article. Okay, so it begins with a title. Always put a title on your assignments in your name, in this case. Okay, so here is my argument in premise conclusion form. That's the first page of the assignment, and it should be a page or less. And make sure, again, I've said this multiple times now, but I'll say it again, each premise should be a concise statement. You have to state something that can be true or false. And the conclusion should also be a concise statement, and you want to make sure you draw that line between the premises and the conclusion, and you want to be sure that you label the conclusion and number each premise so that you can represent them in your map. Second page of my argument map looks like this. Okay, and I actually drew this map using PowerPoint, and then I just took a picture of what I had drawn. So that's one way to do it if you have PowerPoint. If you are having trouble drawing all those arrows on a computer, then you're welcome to do this part by hand, and only this part with the numbers, and make sure you write the numbers very clearly so there's no question of what each number is. Okay, but do not write the argument and premise conclusion form by hand. That part should be typed. Okay, but I've set it so that if you do the first part typed and the second part by hand, you can actually submit two different files. And if you do it by hand, you can just take a picture and submit the picture as the second file. Okay, so your assignment should look something like my assignment, though it will be for one of the articles that I did not map. Okay, and here is a short written statement of what the assignment is. Choose one of the remaining articles for this week and submit a map of the argument presented in the article. The map you submit should match the format of the sample map I created, which is also posted on Moodle, sample argument map. Your version should begin with the argument written in premise conclusion form in a page or less, and then that argument should be symbolized to indicate its structure. Follow the directions given in this lecture. Okay, so map the argument in one of the remaining articles the way I've explained how to map arguments. Okay, so again, the very first thing you should do after you've read the article that you're going to map is try to identify the conclusion of the argument. That's where you should start. Okay, and then write the word conclusion next to it and put it under a big thick line at the bottom of your page and go from there. Okay, as always, please ask any questions. I'll stop saying that, but I really do hope to hear from you because it's hard to teach without being able to receive any feedback from you about how you're understanding this lecture. Okay, I want to leave you with some questions to consider. These questions will not be on the final exam, but they're really important. I would say these are life or death questions, so I hope you'll take some time to think through them. So the first question is about NC State's precautions and their reopening plan. Okay, so what are the precautions that state is taking? What do you know about the reopening plan and what the university is doing to protect you? I'm sure you've gotten lots of messages about how your safety is the priority in reopening. So some questions to ask about that is, well, let's taking the message from the New York Times article by Paxson that we just mapped, who thinks testing, contact tracing, and isolating exposure cases is absolutely crucial to being able to reopen safely. What is NC State's approach to those methods of disease prevention? Are they testing as broadly as the author urges us to test? Is there a real contact tracing plan in place? How are people being isolated if they're exposed or if they're feeling ill? Okay, and then what do you think this author would think of our own university's plan to reopen? Would she support it or not? Okay, so that's the first question. I hope that you will look into that, because it's your own health that is at risk here, as well as all of the people around you. And these are really important considerations. Okay, the second question I want you to consider, and this is after you have read all of the articles assigned for this week, all 3 of them, because they all take a different approach towards the question of reopening. There seems to be a tension between saving the economy and saving people's lives. Okay, we've heard that tension sort of announced explicitly when people have said, no, we need to be willing to give our lives in order to save the economy. Right? And higher education also fits into that tension, right? This idea that we're going to lose higher education if we prioritize saving people's lives to the extent that that the people who urge us not to be on campus are saying that we ought to. The question is, how can we rethink that? Okay, so I don't want you to just think about whether saving lives are worth watching the economy tank, or vice versa. Saving the economy is worth how much death are we willing to tolerate? All right? That's not the question that I'm asking. The question is, does there have to be a tension there? How can we re-envision, how can we rethink these issues of the economy, having a thriving, robust economy, and a healthy populace, and resolve that tension? Okay, that brings me to the third question. What's your vision for how we can do that? Okay, how can we really rethink? We don't have to be, in my personal opinion, stuck in this conception of the economy and public health where the two are in conflict. Okay, is there a way to think about these things in a more productive way that connects our own health and well-being to our economic prosperity? Okay, how can we link those things up so that having a strong functioning economy means that we're all healthier? Is there a way to do that? That's the question. Or actually the question is, what's the way to do that? Okay, I believe that we can do that. So how can we do that? That's my question to you, and that might be the most important question to leave you all with. But lastly, I want to ask one more question, which is what Sorrell means. He's the author of another article that was assigned for this week that many of you will be mapping. What does he mean when he says we need to slow down? Okay, how can we slow down? Okay, and I think those last 3 questions are all related. If we slow down, what's a way to slow down and to be able to rethink these predicaments that we have all around us, threatening our lives? Okay, these are the important questions that I think we should be asking about this pandemic and about coming back to campus in the fall. Okay, so I've spent this lecture, this is the last slide, I've spent this lecture talking about arguments and argument structures, but the reason we're doing that is to be able to think about specifically the argument in the New York Times, which I went into depth in outlining and mapping, but also to be able to think more clearly about all the arguments that we're going to encounter in our readings throughout the semester. Okay, and specifically in the 2 arguments, in the 2 essays that I didn't spend much time addressing in this lecture, part of the reason I did that was because I want to sort of leave the fun to you to figure out what are the arguments being made in those other 2 essays and how are they structured? How are the authors presenting their cases to convince us of their conclusions? That's your task for the week for the argument mapping assignment. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.